Thank you very much, Jody. Another thing we need to be moving towards is getting more younger people involved in politics. And so that's why it's great we've got two of our younger representatives. Today we have Jack Cross and Fraser. Fraser, I think, wrote the speech, and Jack is going to speak on behalf. But please make welcome Jack and Fraser, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. It is fantastic to have the opportunity to speak to you all this evening, although I know most of you will be waiting for the main act, which it will be Gerard. And it is only right that I start by thanking Gerard for his work. We're all here to support the movement that he has started, and it's his intelligence, moral clarity, policy focus and willingness to go against the grain that has inspired us to join People First, and that's what we need to show the electorate. I also need to thank Pip, Jody, Bob, the rest of the state executive team, all our volunteers, and of course Fraser for helping to organise this weekend of events. We're immensely grateful to People First WA for providing us with this opportunity to talk about what matters to under 30s and how our new party can give hope to young people. People First does mean Australians first, and in particular we want it to mean young Australians first. As Gerard has always said, for too long the establishment parties have put the interests of foreign banks, foreign governments and multinational corporations before those of ordinary people. It isn't just enough to put the major parties last on election day, go home and pat ourselves on the back. We know we need to rebuild, we're serious about fixing this country, and we will be ready to govern, hopefully with many more representatives than just Gerard. And most importantly, we must make certain that People First representatives are here to serve Australians and not to fiddle around the edges of our problems while the country burns and then transfer from Parliament into cushy consulting jobs. For young people, the promise of People First is in rebuilding and protecting our national inheritance. Australia is an immensely wealthy nation, both culturally and economically, and it could very easily be maintained. Our way of life is unique, it can be sustained, but it requires constant vigilance and much damage has already been done. A quite obvious failure is the state of the housing market. Home ownership has always been central to the Australian way of life, providing the foundation for family formation. It's a natural aspiration to own your own parcel of your own country, to build not only your home, but your life. Every capital in the country is now amongst the most unaffordable in the world. We must count ourselves lucky in WA, unfortunately, to have a median house price below $1 million. The housing market is an outright Ponzi scheme, and the situation has only been deteriorating for as long as I've been alive. Recently, we've been told that there's a new way to fix the housing market and the affordability crisis. We can import more immigrants to build more houses to house more immigrants. Curiously, only 3% of Albanese immigrants who have arrived in the last 5 years have had any relevant skills for the housing and construction sector. If we're going to have any immigration at all, you would think that it should at least help to cover labour shortages in these critical industries. But we know the vast majority of immigration has been unskilled. All the same, the door is open and everyday Australians are forced to compete for jobs, houses and resources with the entire developing world. To flood the country with immigrants during a housing crisis as bad as this is nothing short of criminal. At worst, we've got people living out of their cars, and at best, they're not able to have children while they scrimp and save for a mortgage that is worth 8 times their income. The numbers on all of this seem to be getting worse. In 1981, the average age for an Australian to be mortgage-free was 52. In 2016, it had jumped to 62, and it is only getting worse. The 2021 census revealed that nearly 1 in 4 Australians aged 55 to 64 was still paying off their home loan, almost double the rate from 2 decades earlier. I'm often asked why young people join the Greens. Well, when you look at the state of the country and consider what it will look like in 25 years, you can very easily see the appeal that the Greens have. Our generation has only ever known home ownership as a near mythical aspiration. If it's attainable at all, it will be substantially later and a much higher cost than it has ever been for previous generations. Faced with potentially a lifetime of renting, it is only natural that my generation seek to protect their material interests by voting for pro-renter Greens. Labor's new 5% deposits and an expansion of the first homeowner guarantee scheme have only made the situation worse for us. It does nothing to make housing more affordable or to address the ongoing shortage of supply, and only allows more people to borrow more money, loosening the prerequisites for approvals. It shuffles us closer to a future populated by a young underclass of stressed out debt slaves, deep in negative equity, scraping to pay for a dog box in the middle of nowhere, and for a property worth 8 times our income. The truth is, we have a ruling class and a government populated by midwits who don't believe in solutions, only the managed decline of our country. Nowhere is this more evident than their shameful approach to housing and immigration policy. And who even needs political enemies? Our supposedly right-of-centre allies, like Paul Scar and Alex Hawke, are too busy bigging up a girl boss, Susan Lee, whose brightest idea recently was crying about a band t-shirt. People's First existing policy has outlined the absurdity of our housing situation quite well, including by noting our increased reliance on foreign debt to keep the gravy train rolling and lending against housing. While Australians are struggling more on their repayments, foreign bondholders are making a killing as our wealth continues to be siphoned offshore. Leaning so heavily on housing as a speculative investment means that prices will keep inflating and more capital is going to be moved away from other vital sectors of the economy, which could be far more productive, creating and embellishing economic growth figures while hollowing out real productive growth. We all know that Gen Z is unfortunately moving to the left. The Liberals are a party that my generation does not understand, does not know, has never voted for and will never consider voting for. We are a far cry from the rusted-ons that the coalition are still trying to rely upon for votes. And, let's face it, much of that elderly generation is already fleeing to One Nation. The last federal election wasn't just about the complete embarrassing flogging of the Liberals. It was also the first time since the creation of the Liberal Party in 1944 that independent and minor candidates had outpolled a major party. Not all of that can be explained away by young people voting for the Greens. Not everyone under 30 is voting Greens, although 40% of young women are. It's that they're voting for anybody but the Liberal Party. And, surprisingly enough, that's a good thing, because even if Labor does win the next election, it allows us an opportunity to build a genuine opposition to the Labor Party rather than a controlled one. Although the Greens have had better luck with electing, and arguably more importantly with actually retaining their elected representatives, than other parties such as One Nation, there is no doubt that the Greens are still a joke. The preferred solutions that they put forward to the housing crisis amount to rent control and open borders. This would mean more private landlords opting to sell up, as well as an acceleration of the demand-side pressures that are fueling this reckless, unsustainable bubble of overvaluation that we've been seeing, especially if you want to live in the cities or anywhere close to them. Capping immigration, as People First have consistently promoted, can act as a pressure release valve for the housing market, just as we saw during the border closures. And although there would be a fair bit of turbulence in the market, one thing that you would be certain to see is a fall in prices. For those who aren't even in the market yet because they've been priced out of doing so, or they're so demoralised that they're no longer trying, this would be a welcome but long overdue development. It is a demand-side measure that will help young Australians get ahead instead of doing what they can to keep from drowning. And it is highly disingenuous, of course, to ignore or downplay the effects of mass immigration on housing availability and affordability. Yet that's exactly what scores of politicians and so-called experts will try to do in the press and their obscure academic journals. These people will look you in the eye and pretend that supply and demand do not exist. The existing national immigration policy is a terrible one for a myriad of reasons, but in short, it is unsustainable, susceptible to rorts, places downward pressure on wages and upward pressure on house prices and rent. It decreases our social cohesion, especially by importing overseas ethnic and religious conflicts, and it is consistently unaccounted for and uncontrolled by our elites and their institutions. After I run through this next set of numbers, it should be clear that our ruling class is either incompetent, malicious, or a dangerous combination of both. The numbers don't lie, and sadly they do not inspire confidence or hope for the future if we have at least 6 more years of this government to get through. Immigration is consistently higher than the Treasury forecasts. As Alan Kohler pointed out in a piece for the ABC, these forecasts in each budget paper are the only attempt to put a figure on future immigration. There's usually a target for permanent and skilled migration, but not for the overall number, which includes students, working holiday makers, and permanent and skilled migrants, which are only a small part of the total. He continues, for 2021, Treasury's forecast was 41,000. It turned out to be 203,590. For both 2022 to 23 and the 2023 to 24 financial years, the forecast was 235,000. In those years, it turned out to be 535,520 and 445,640. We were forecast 260,000 for 2024 to 2025, and this figure, which was just released this week, indicated that net permanent and long-term arrivals for the year to September totalled 468,390, the highest 12-month total on record. However, as the ABS has pointed out in a rare statement to the media, that's a different data set to net overseas migration since the number of people will emigrate from Australia too, which I'm sure makes all the difference. That means Treasury underestimated the number of arrivals by well over 800,000 people. By way of comparison, Bunbury has a population of 75,000 in the 2021 census. The net effect of this inaccurate modelling and forecasting has meant that we will have a monumental housing shortfall. Just for WA, SQM research found that there will be no building surplus for 2025, with WA expected to build 16,800 dwellings, while the population expands by at least 90,000. So, there are hundreds of thousands more cars on the road than expected, hundreds of thousands more people looking for healthcare than expected, and hundreds of thousands more kids in schools than expected. And a generation of young Australians, my generation, get to compete with these new arrivals for a place in our own country. But people will sit here and they will scratch their heads wondering how we can close the gap of generational wealth inequality, or they will point the finger at a mysterious group of baby boomers who committed a horrific crime by buying a house when it was cheaper and the government was a little less insane. So, what have we under 30s just witnessed during this last round of elections, state and federal? We have a federal housing minister who on the one hand admits the housing market is not working properly, but then on the other hand we have two major parties who share tacit and sometimes explicit agreement that house prices by design must forever increase. Sadly, only one of the major parties got wiped out. Deporting illegal immigrants and violent criminals, it really goes without saying and should be an uncontroversial policy, but what is particularly great about People First is how targeted and effective our immigration policy will be about controlling and streamlining this for decades. Abolishing the Administrative Review Tribunal, for a start, is one measure which we would support and streamline the deportation process. We have around 400,000 people in the country on bridging visas with their country of origin before they even reapply for a visa to stay in Australia. A bridging visa is usually issued for one of two reasons. Either the Department of Home Affairs cannot process a visa application while the applicant is onshore before the previous law. They are provided to those whose visas have expired while they are already arranging to leave the country. If Administrative Review Tribunal appeals are clogged up with former students who aren't making a good faith effort to return home anytime soon, that does not speak to a strong or efficient immigration system. Instead, it's quite the opposite. We also support repealing and replacing our recent Australia-India Migration Pact, also known as the Migration and Mobility Partnership, flow of temporary workers and students into Australia with no corresponding benefit to our own country. It puts strain onto housing and services and should never have been used, or anything similar, should never have been used as a precondition for a trade agreement with India. A country with around 1.5 billion people has no business implementing this arrangement with a much less densely populated country such as our own. We don't want to compromise on our quality of life. If we want a big Australia, we can in fact grind everyone down into a small pace and we could easily fit millions and millions of us into the space of one apartment building. But density is not the goal of the Australian dream, and it is not the dream that we wish to put forward for young Australians. People First's official platform proposes a cap of 100,000 net overseas migrants per year, which is a clear improvement on all other political nations. If implemented, it would almost certainly result in net zero, if not a net negative immigration figure into Australia, which is what we desperately need to correct our shambolic housing market. People will undoubtedly point out that we already have a cap. That, however, is a permanent migration cap, not a temporary migration cap. In February alone, we took in almost 200,000 international students, and we did the same thing last February. Next February, the cap will be increased to 260,000. But whether a new arrival is a permanent or a temporary migrant is meaningless, because whatever your class of visa, you still have a job. Education being tutored as one of our top exports is also misleading students as an export and does not distinguish whether that money is coming from an Australian employer or from overseas. If people are arriving to study, deferring or transferring into ghost colleges, and then working in low-skilled sectors, you have a backdoor migration program, not an export, and it is an entire pipeline which People First intends to shut down for good. Conversely, if people are arriving, paying remittances, as in sending money back to their home countries, and then going, the country is not growing its wealth, it is acting as a piggy bank for the entire developing world. Ordinary people do not stand to benefit from this influx of temporary migrants, although university vice-chancellors and administrators, property developers and speculators who own dog box apartments certainly do. According to recent polling conducted for The Australian, 64% of voters want less people moving permanently to Australia. Of that 64%, 39% wanted a lot less, while only 10% wanted an increase. Consistently in these surveys, an increase is an absolute minority position. Immigration is projected to drop over the next decade, but there is a caveat in that analysis. It will only drop if the government does not intervene in existing policy settings. But we've consistently seen that whenever things look like they might turn around and we might have a fresh start, our government and our opposition will always intervene to keep the housing Ponzi scheme going. But People First will put Australians first. We're not obsessed with red lines on charts, and we're not going to harp on about GDP. GST is important. We care about living standards and whether our economic decisions will impact ordinary Australians and whether they will be in their best interests. If immigration truly is so great for our economy and for our future, why have we experienced the worst drop in OECD living standards, including per capita real household incomes, since 2019? Why is our real income not projected to recover until the early 2030s? Have our wages grown or even just kept pace with inflation? No. How many people our age can buy a decent house in a decent area on one income or even a modest combined income? And how many can even aspire to? Centre-right parties the world over, and even some centre-left parties in Europe, have taken this seriously, so there's no reason Australia can't too. We are a lucky country and the most beautiful place to live on earth. But if we keep going down the path of mass migration to prop out our universities and to inflate our house prices, our luck must inevitably run out. A country is not an economic zone, nor is it a dumping ground for the world's grievances. If you don't have control of your borders, you have an airport, not a country. We are at that stage, and this pretensive political discourse where we come up with moderate reforms within arbitrarily agreed upon boundaries of rhetoric do not make sense. The promise of People First extends beyond housing. The party's proposed HECS changes were superior to Labor's offering at the last federal election because they are ambitious and structural in nature rather than a one-off deduction. Applying a 20% discount to all upfront or extra repayments of debt, scrapping it entirely for teachers and nurses, and ensuring contributions are applied in real time when calculating indexation on the loan would significantly ease the debt burden on this generation. If you consider the rest of People's First policies, we have plenty of methods to raise this revenue elsewhere, including by increasing the withholding tax rate on profits sent offshore, without relying on the borderline predatory nature of HECS loans. Without reform, a large portion of HECS loans will inevitably be written off at taxpayer expense. We're also in favour of several other key People First policies concerning income splitting, raising the tax-free threshold to $45,000, flexible childcare arrangements for young families, and of course, state ownership of our critical infrastructure such as ports and dams. Young People First are happy to announce our plans to begin releasing policy white papers in the near future concerning a few different topics of interest that we think the party could improve its messaging on, including our catastrophizing. We want to do our best to preserve what we have left of the Jarrah Forest and the red-tailed black cockatoos here in WA, for example. We're also facing down the imminent intrusion of government on freedom of speech and expression, with just under a month left until the under-16 social media ban comes into effect. Profiles to begin building an online presence and advertising the party's policy offering. We're confident that putting forward a vision for the future aligns support in this key age bracket. We will be establishing a parallel branch structure to connect our young members and support the development of policy that reflects our interests. Early next year, we'll also see a substantial recruitment drive. Our ultimate goal, from a party of government, but to build an energetic and committed base of supporters and volunteers that People First can rely on to get our first. Young Australians have been given precious little reason to be excited for their future. People First has presented an opportunity to imagine what life in Australia could look like in years to come. Our generation has no choice but to be aware of our problems, but we are excited to be part of the solution. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jack. Young Australians is certainly an area we should be focusing on.